is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott. We've had a very good first quarter to the year for crypto asset prices. Bitcoin is up 83%, Ethereum not far behind, around 78%. And now we're starting to see that classic cycle trade where people are selling out of Bitcoin and into some of the other assets in this asset class. Beneath the surface, though, there's a lot of really interesting things happening in Web3. I think we've gone through a couple cycles recently where we've become overly fixated on price. But I think what really gets us going, and obviously why we've gotten to 85 episodes of the show, is that we're always fascinated to hear from all of these different entrepreneurs and innovators and builders that are doing really exciting things, reimagining everything from financial services to creative industries to sort of how we organize capability online. And it's these Web3 use cases that I think are going to prove really transformational. We've got a really great guest for today's episode. It's my friend Chjango Unchained, who's the host of the Cosmos radio station, Interchain.fm. She's a validator for, an investor of, and an advisor to several Cosmos app chains. Prior to this, she was a principal architect who bootstrapped the top 20 decentralized project, Cosmos Network, driving the market capitalization from zero to well over $1 billion within 3 years. Today, Cosmos is the 22nd largest crypto asset project. It's also one of the leading platforms for decentralized application development, and Chjango is there at the very early stages. Prior to Cosmos, she worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. So not only is she an ex-rocket scientist, she's also Cosmos's resident space cowboy, and we're going to ask what exactly that means soon enough on the show. But without further ado, Chjango, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Very glad to be here. I've listened to several episodes of yours in the past, and they're great, and you share some great insights.
Well, I appreciate that, and we've listened to yours as well. And it's your insight and all the people that you're interviewing that I think gives you this really wide lens into all the kind of interesting stuff that people are doing, especially in the Cosmos network, but also writ large in Web3. And before we get into that, though, I just love to understand, how does someone go from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to working full-time in Web3? We'd love to hear your story.
Well, thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. And I first got into cryptocurrency jumping off the back of my work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I got into Bitcoin originally because I saw it as this freedom technology that helped regular citizens like myself circumvent the powers that be. It seemed to be this way to peacefully opt out of an economy that's completely controlled by unelected officials, unelected by myself, who I viewed as not representative of the interests of regular citizens. So that was what drew me into Bitcoin. And fast forward a few more years, in 2017, that was when I started working on Cosmos and bootstrapping the community and marketing and early ecosystem from then on, and the rest is history.
Yeah. And so what were you doing at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory before we dig into the Cosmos stuff? Like, were you working in the science side of things? Was it something else? Like, I just love to understand that a bit better.
So I wasn't working in the science side of things, but in order for any of the NASA laboratories to acquire work, you need to create a proposal and a cost estimate to the government, basically, because these are all government funded. So that was the work that I did. It's actually much less sexy than the rocket scientist.
Yeah, well, it's like procuring all of the things that go into the rocket.
Yeah, right.
That I mean, that stuff's kind of important work, right?
Yeah. And specifically, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory focused on Mars. So we were procuring contracts to take Curiosity. Curiosity was the campaign that was relevant during my time there, and before we sent it over, because one of the previous rovers got stuck in a crater.
I hope that's not a metaphor for what's going on in our industry today. But
Yeah.
why don't you tell us a little bit about the trip into Cosmos? I just love the idea that, you worked at JPL and then, you were working on the Mars project and then also ended up with the project called Cosmos. There's a lot of like spacefaring metaphors to be bandied around as we discuss this. But what was that journey like to, discovering Cosmos? Because I think a lot of people who've been in this space for long enough definitely got their start with Bitcoin. And I think some of them fell into that cypherpunk or crypto anarchist culture. And I think a lot of people shared similar views that you did, that even if they weren't like dead set opposed to the fiat currency system, that in it they saw room for improvement and a potential path to greater autonomy and sovereignty in an asset like Bitcoin, right? And I think like everybody's different, not everyone has the same story. But then oftentimes, people starting in Bitcoin ended up moving on to something else. A lot of them stayed in Bitcoin, but a lot of them moved on. But that doesn't mean that they decided that Bitcoin wasn't interesting or wasn't valuable or didn't serve all of those initial purposes. But they thought maybe the technology held even more promise or more versatile than it is for just say sovereign money of some kind. So I always want to sort of figure out what that narrative arc looks like. So for you, what was that journey like?
Well, the thing about being enthusiastic about Bitcoin early days, but if you were not a software developer, and even if you are a software developer, the barrier to entry to really contribute to Bitcoin is incredibly high. You need to be effectively a systems engineer, and in a paradigm where it's completely new. You need to learn blockchain speak and peer-to-peer and all of these. So there wasn't a way for someone like me to contribute to Bitcoin, even though theoretically, in theory, I really aligned with the ideology and culture. But it was in Cosmos where I found my home, where I could really, blaze the path for something that wasn't done before. Because when we were starting Cosmos, there were really few proof of stake chains, few and far in between, especially ones that were security or like safety favoring, right?
Yeah.
And the only things that were being talked about in proof of stake were either Tendermint BFT or liveness favoring chains like Casper, either correct by construction or the finality gadget. So in Cosmos, that was where I found that I could contribute the most and do the most damage in a good way. And 2017, proof of stake was new, unproven, and so we did something that was innovative that has now sort of become an industry standard, which is launch an incentivized testnet to bootstrap a validator set. Right? No one had thought of it in those terms before. No one thought to apply bounties basically to do like testnet testing. So it wasn't until Cosmos where I could really contribute, and there weren't really roles outside of engineering that people could contribute within. Right now there's different roles. There's operations, there's marketing, PR agencies have come into work, there's HR, all of these different responsibilities that go with basically startup work that didn't exist back then. So it was in blazing the path in Cosmos where I could do something. And the other thing is, ecosystem development was not a thing. I literally made up that job role, and now it's a thing.
Yeah.
People
not only is a thing, it's a highly coveted skill set or job description or candidate that people are looking for. Because I think that when it comes, there's so many things I want to unpack from what you just described there. But this is as much about social consensus and about community as it is about hard technological capability for a lot of these networks, right? And figuring out how to unlock the power of your community to create an ecosystem where there's room for experimentation and collaboration, and where people are excited and remain engaged is kind of like really important, because without that, it's like if we build it, they will come. Not necessarily, to use a reference to the Field of Dreams film, which I don't know if you've seen, but anyway, the idea like if you build it, like they will come. Well, not always, right? You need to figure out a way to coax and cajole and to encourage people to use your technology, right? So in many respects, you
And
kind of
the thing
pioneered
is,
that role. So tell us a little bit about that.
right. The thing is, if you strip everything in the space down to just pure technology, well, you have to ask, what's the moat that each ecosystem has? Well, it's an ecosystem. The moat is its community. In a world where liquidity is fickle and the speculator is costlessly bridging their assets to and from every other chain to chase yields from the next DeFi protocol that does an airdrop. So what is the stickiness that causes people to stay? They come for the yields, but stay for the what? That's the question that, as a community builder, you have to ask yourself.
When you were first involved in the Bitcoin community, you said that like there was not that much room for someone like you. Now, the way you described it, it sounded like, oh, you needed to be a hardcore systems engineer, in those early days. But at any point in time, did you feel like the community was unwelcoming or maybe closed off to certain kinds of people, and that something like Cosmos is a bit more welcoming or open-minded? I'm wondering if that was any part of it, because there is a critique of people who are into Bitcoin hardcore way today, whether that's an earned reputation or not, we can debate, that it's sort of, masculine and like white and maybe a little hostile towards other kinds of people. I don't know, like if you have any thoughts on that.
So when couple of things, and we need to unpack the chronological order of events that occurred in Bitcoin. So the birth of the Bitcoin maxi emerged after the Bitcoin scaling debates. So I entered the space much before the Bitcoin scaling debates happened. So my experience with the community, because the Bitcoin community was the crypto community. There was the Bitcoin community and the Ethereum community, and those were basically the only two ecosystems that existed. And it was the most welcoming, open-minded community that I've ever. Here's my experience being in the milieu of Wall Street, and I was never in the Wall Street industry, but that was where I experienced the most condescension. It was from like Wall Street finance types. And it was such a stark contrast to crypto people, where anyone that I talked to and I asked questions from the lens of being someone completely new, they never assumed that I didn't know certain things, and rather just presented the information. And that was the most welcoming that I've ever felt. And which is why I felt that cryptocurrency was my home for the rest of my life, because of the quality of people that were in it. Post Bitcoin scaling debate, post, the war between SegWit versus, small blocks, versus, like extension blocks or like SegWit 2x. That was when the toxicity really emerged, because it was a war between ideologies. Right. And ultimately the core developers won. And from somebody who watched from the inside or like on the peripheries of the inside, basically from talking to people who were part of the war, They used really, it was like a lightweight, like Nazi propaganda tactics, not Nazi propaganda, not literally, but I mean, they turned, Reddit or Bitcoin into a propaganda machine. They character assassinated anyone who disagreed with them. So a lot of those tactics were present during the debates. And so that was where toxicity and, creating polarizing narratives came from. And that kind of just stuck. And so that's where
one of the things that I find really disappointing about Bitcoin, because like I agree with you in the early, and I think you were in this even earlier than I was, but I first started to pay attention to this stuff and talk to people in 2014, 2015, and it was a year and a half or so before those scaling wars took place, and this was before the Ethereum launch. So there was definitely a cadre of people who were really excited about Ethereum, and that's when I first heard Jay and Ethan present Cosmos for the very first time. I think it was 2016. But I agree, it was like anybody who was into crypto was into Bitcoin. There wasn't that big of a distinction. And and I think it's more these days that the most ardent proponents do definitely take a hard line, and that's why they're called maximalists, right? And this word toxic's been bandied about. I don't think everybody who loves Bitcoin is toxic, but I think that there's some people who take it to the nth degree. But the irony is that this underlying asset class, like Bitcoin, is of all crypto assets the one that's probably most widely held and most used by a very global and diverse population of people. And if you look at Chainalysis or the Human Rights Foundation, like these groups do work into this. The whole idea is that it's a general purpose sort of technology, or that it's an asset class that is non-ideological. It's ideological in the sense that it promotes and empowers self-sovereignty, but it's also something that kind of anybody can use, and I think that's what makes it really interesting. Anyway, I didn't mean to get down a whole Bitcoin rabbit hole here, but I thought your comments were kind of illuminating in that respect. So okay, so I started the show today just talking about how like prices have rebounded. Now, obviously, they're rebounding off of a low, and what was kind of like the annus horribilis for crypto. Like yes, last year was awful for the industry. So we're still way below our all-time highs. Ethereum's at 2,000 versus 4,000. Cosmos is at 12 or 13 versus say 35 or whatever. And I look at asset prices because we've got a Bitcoin ETF that we're converting into multi-asset fund shortly. And so we're always thinking about this, but I'm also just generally more interested in like the underlying drivers of Web3 and what's actually like pushing this higher. Is this just a bounce off of the bottom? Are we benefiting from maybe a little more positive sentiment in investors from investors in general? Or is this reflecting some sort of more interesting underlying truth that there's some interesting stuff going on, I guess. So anyway, so from your seat, from your vantage point, when talking to all these entrepreneurs and creators, like what is the Web3 vibe check that we can do right now? Like, what do you see going on right now?
In terms of price, there's the sell the news event, right? So Ethereum Shanghai upgrade happened. Yeah. And so that was one of those events that drives a rallying event, similar to when the Ethereum merge happened, and that was when ETH rallied last year. But on the fundamentals side, the building has never stopped. So even when the price has tanked, I was still getting the same, if not more, amount of guests wanting to come on the podcast to talk about their project as in a bull market. In fact, I've never had to slow down cadence due to lack of supply of projects launching mainnets. So that's a testament to the strength of the industry. It's not what the news headlines would have you think that, just because the price of Bitcoin was down 50% since all-time high and altcoins have been down 90% since all-time high, that the industry is dead, right? Fundamentally, that's the building has never stopped. And in fact, between 2022, just the ultimate low of crypto, and the peak of 2017, our last bull market, we've had over 2 times the amount of daily active users still. And so what does that say about the industry? It's continuing on this upward trend of adoption, and I don't see it stopping anytime until it becomes the norm. I think we have a good.
So just to understand, so basically from like the low point last year, still had double the users as the high point of 2017, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's in 5 years.
Yeah.
What does that tell you?
Yeah. Well, it suggests the fundamentals are strong.
Mm-hmm.
And we track a lot of this too on our quantitative desk, where we look at a lot of the on-chain metrics for different assets, and even with Bitcoin, the number of addresses continues to surge higher, which isn't always a sign of new users. Not every address is a user, obviously, because you can have many addresses per user. But we're also seeing other metrics like wallets with the minimum balance of, say, $200, for example. That's increasing, and so we're seeing amount of Bitcoin that's moving off exchange into like self-custody wallets is increasing. So it seems like there's a couple of trends just on the Bitcoin thing, because that's where the most data is. But basically that you're seeing a lot of first-time users, a lot of new wallet creation, and you're also seeing maybe users becoming a bit more savvy about the asset class and its underlying value, which is that maybe you don't want to hold it on exchanges. And probably the collapse of FTX and also even the collapse of like Silicon Valley Bank and these other financial institutions, I think is calling into question a lot of people's long-held belief that maybe their money is safe somewhere when it isn't, right? And so I think that's another thing that probably helps to strengthen the argument for the asset class. So of the guests that you've had recently, what are the things that you're seeing that have you the most excited?
The things that excite me are novelty and originality. So and original ideas come few and far in between. But where we are now is we're at the leading edge of this notion of modular architectures. So I think in Cosmos and Celestia in particular, we have the benefit of.
Sorry, just Cosmos and Celestia. What was that?
Celestia.
Yeah, can you tell us about that?
So Celestia was proposed sometime in 2018. It was started by Mustafa Al-Bassam. He's this legendary hacker in the crypto anarchist sort of hacker space culture. And he paired up with one of our ex-core developers on the peer-to-peer side, Ishmael Coffee. Ishmael was working on Tendermint BFT, specifically the ABCI and our tree. And the two of them paired up to start something called Celestia. And in order to wrap your head around Celestia, you have to imagine ETH2 with its set of rollups. But imagine if Ethereum were without its execution layer and smart contracting capabilities, but rather those features are abstracted away onto the rollups themselves. So all of the base layer does is do data availability. So so they've called it the modular stack. And if you look at what blockchains are at the very primitive level, like what is a blockchain composed of? A, the execution layer, B, data availability, C, security, right? The consensus. So imagine if you could do smart contracting on its own rollup. So the way that the Cosmos architecture kind of blew people's minds out of the water was by saying that, well, you could have your own DApp as its own app chain.
Yeah.
But within the Cosmos paradigm, what was missing was there's a central hub. I mean, that was the Cosmos hub was part of the hub and spoke architecture, but fundamentally the hub right now doesn't necessarily do anything for app chains, right? They're completely sovereign. So imagine if you have a hub whose application specific job is to do DA.
Yeah.
And then all the other app chains get DA from it, but they get to like run their own application logic
Right.
without needing to run their own DA layer.
So I'm glad that you brought this up, and it's an important point that we actually talk about a lot on the show, which is, how does Web3 scale, and what are the underlying blockchain architectures, and how does that work? And we have had Sunny and Ethan and Greg Osuri and others on the show. So we're not a Cosmos you're using a lot of Cosmos language, and actually I think a lot of our listeners will get it, because I think we have people who are just like big Cosmos people who listen to this. But there's some other people who are not, including like stockbrokers and more traditional finance people. So just to be by way of sort of explanation of what you're talking about, the Ethereum model basically is that there's one supercomputer and everything sort of settles to one main chain. And all of the smart contracting logic and all of the state and all of the security happens in one place, right? And then maybe there are these layer twos that sort of help you to batch process transactions. So you can do a bunch of transactions, then batch them, and then kind of like reconcile them to the main chain. And like Cosmos's design is a bit different, where application developers have way more sovereignty over their the underlying technology that they use, that they can start their own app chain, so to speak, but that there are some benefits to being connected into IBC or into sort of Cosmos itself. And what's interesting is that I think that we're of the view on the show, not the show has a view, but basically that the idea of applications having their own chains makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot of risk inherent, obviously, in just sort of standing up a blockchain. What's to say that it's going to be, secure, that the code itself is going to be, vetted and so forth. And so that's where you get this sort of like hybrid, what I would describe as a hybrid model of sorts, where you have the sovereignty, but then you have all these shared benefits of being connected into the main chain. Like that's my layperson sort of explanation of this. And it seems to me like you're describing that in essence right now. Is that basically correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the way that I would frame it is the ETH model that you've just described is a generation 1 model for doing this. And then Cosmos emerged as sort of a generation 2. And what I'm describing with modular architectures is 3rd gen.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So this is the last step then.
It may not be the last step, but it's a step function improvement in order for the space as a whole to reach its next 100 million users or so.
Right.
With the Ethereum model and the Cosmos model, we may not necessarily get there, but some thought leaders in the space, and I'm talking about Polonia, think that in 5-10 years from now, 90% or more of blockchains are going to run as their own rollups. And then the layer ones like Cosmos Hub or the DA layers like Celestia or like Ethereum Solana, these will become relegated to being DA layers and not where application logic gets run.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had Anatolian from Solana, and like anyway, it's everyone's got a very different vision for how this works. But like, the idea that we're going to have one giant mainframe we're all going to plug into versus the idea that everyone's got their own, MacBook. I mean, not that that's always a straight shot analogy, but it does make sense that people should have like more autonomy over their whatever they're doing than to be all connected into some main system. But anyway, I digress. So tell us about, just like before we wrap up, love to just get a snapshot of like, what are you doing today? How are you contributing to all these things? I mean, you're obviously deeply knowledgeable. That explanation of Celestia and modular architecture is the clearest thing I've heard from anyone on the subject. But like, where are you spending your time? And how are you contributing to the development of the industry and to the ecosystem?
Right now, I'm scaling up my validator, the Interchain FM stake validator across different Cosmos chains. And the most obvious way that I contribute to the ecosystem is through my podcast, Interchain FM. The idea was that it shouldn't just be industry insiders that get access to information first. It should be anyone in real time as the insiders get their information.
Yeah.
So when I was starting off, I would talk to a bunch of different people, have meetings, and then understand what's being built in real time. I said, okay, well, why shouldn't others also get access to this? Because in the internet age, your biggest edge is information. If you don't have anything else, if you don't have capital to start off with, if you don't have any other edge, it's information and the ability to parse information. So this podcast is a way to democratize access to information, so to speak.
Yeah. We think of ourselves as doing something over here that's similar, but not only are we democratizing, we're trying to decode. We're called DeFi Decoded. Would you say that your listenership is mostly people like crypto people in the Cosmos ecosystem? Or like, do you find that you're capturing people from other groups? Like, is there anything about your listeners that surprises you?
There's certainly a lot of them in the Cosmos ecosystem that could get the lingo, but I do capture some audiences that may be a little bit newer. And what I'm attempting to do is to cast a wider net by speaking in more layman's terms, because it can get very idiosyncratic very fast. And
yeah, go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, everything in preparation for the next bull market, because with every bull market, there's going to be, new blood in space, and they're going to want to access information. Right. But, it tends to be the YouTubers who, had a large channel of over 100,000 followers that talked about something completely different, that during a bull market, they pivoted to a crypto specific channel. And then they don't necessarily give listeners a good information. In fact, a lot of them tend to give them bad information and then trade against their listeners. and that's something that I think is it harms the space. So speaking more to a layman's audience that's where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of Web3 as a next era of the web, then in the same way that everybody uses a web browser or a smartphone, everyone's going to be involved with this, right? Like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. So it's got to be clear and accurate information. And I think you do a great service in the industry. And I think that you're right, that there's probably a lot of disinformation or inaccurate or incomplete information. And I think that's just a reality. I mean, that's the reality of the world we live in. Like, for better or for worse, the web makes everyone a publisher of information. And I think overall, that's a very positive thing, but it leads to like a deluge of bad content. And so separating the wheat from chaff is always a struggle. So to help people do that, where can they learn more about you, Interchain FM, and everything that you're up to?
Yeah, right now I'm doing an Interchain Jam series that's right on the Cosmos Twitter, or you could find me on interchain.fm. I also have my own YouTube channel, which is just called Chjango Unchained. And that's where all of the information is. It's a bit of like eating your vegetables. I'm trying to make it more like eating dessert. Right. Yeah. But you're going to want, it takes a bit of discipline and attention to go through hour-long interviews of just straight technical content. So
yeah, fair enough. And of course, you're a great follow on Twitter too. So I would encourage everyone to check you out there. All right, that concludes today's episode of DeFi Decoded, from one podcaster to another. Thank you very much for joining us. We really, I had a lot of fun on that on this call, on this discussion. It was a great chat. Hope to have you back again soon. And who knows? I hope I pass the audition to come on your show at some point in the future too.
Oh, you're coming on. Your book is launching. I'm excited about that.
Yes. Shh, quiet. We're holding that back until the big launch. No. Thanks again, and see you next time. Take care.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.